Hi, Thomas from Field Tennis. The following video is only about 10% of the instruction from the Effortless Forehand video course, but I hope that it will help you develop the fundamentals of the forehand stroke and clear up the confusion that you may have about the forehand technique. If you want to learn more about the course and learn the remaining 90% of the information on how to develop an effortless forehand, just click the card above. How you grip the racket is very important for your stroke, because the grip translates the feel from the racket head, from the strings that interact with the ball, to your hand, and therefore you feel what's going on with the ball and you know how to manipulate it. And if something is not right with the grip, then your strokes will not have good control, regardless of how your other external technique looks like. Now, what I want to mention is that even though your hand can be on the correct bevel, on the right bevel, you might be holding the racket incorrectly. And the most common mistake is that the hand is perpendicular to the handle. So when the player holds the racket, they hold it like this, there is a straight line here, so like a perpendicular line. So let's say if I'm showing now, let's say a semi-western grip, this would be a semi-western grip that's not correct, because the fingers are close together and the index finger is not underneath the handle. It's not helping a lot with the support. So the correct grip would be when we spread the fingers a little bit, so that you see the index finger under the racket like this. So from this angle, this would be the grip, the semi-western grip that you should hold. The reason why we want the finger here is because it helps us, if I show you like this with two fingers only, it helps us push the racket up. So when we swing and we come to the ball, then this finger helps us use the wrist and rotate the racket when we have to, for example, spin the ball in a certain way. So it gives us very good support under the racket, and the racket is nicely resting. If you hold like this, then you will feel a very heavy racket on this side, and you will have to tighten up your wrist and use a lot of wrist muscles to control the racket head. So you will feel very tight, you will work all the time. But this way it's much easier. Now that we've set the grip right, we need to get in a ready position. Now I oftentimes see players in a ready position like this, but they're not in a ready state, because they are just standing like this, they're waiting to see the ball and then they start playing. So that's a ready position, but not a ready state. A ready state is a state where you are moving, you feel like you're dancing. So you can be dancing from foot to foot like this, or you can be even doing like this, like mini split steps, but you have to do something. So whenever the ball is in play, we never stand. We don't stand for a split second, we are always moving. So we're moving from foot to foot, then we're moving to the ball, we're moving back, we're moving all the time on the court. We never stop, because this movement is also a reflection of our mind. So moving in our body means that our mind is alert and ready to react. And if we are standing, we are static, and so will our mind be static. So we're not really alert, we're not ready to react. And so when the ball changes direction from our opponent's racket and it will go somewhere, we will be late to react. And so that's why I'm pointing this out, even though we are in the technique section of the forehand. It is so important that you don't stand, that you're not just in a ready position, but yet you are in a ready state. A good way to get in a ready state is to use a jump rope. So if you do a jump rope, it will get you into that constant, continuous movement, and you will feel that state, and then you can transfer that state from the jump rope on the court and try and feel very similar, that all the time you're alert, you're moving, you're dancing from foot to foot. And that way you're going to be able to react quickly when the ball comes. Of course, the next step after the movement is the split step, but I've described the split step in detail on my website, fieldtennis.net, and it's for free, so I will give you a link to the article so that you can study the split step. So there's no need for me to explain it here anymore. but without a split step, again, you will not be able to react fast and move well to the ball. So if you're not moving and if you're not doing a split step, you're not really playing tennis. You're doing something else, but you're not really playing tennis. So make sure that you add this to your game, because otherwise you will never play well. It's impossible to play tennis well if you're just standing and if you don't split step. The first thing you do when you see the ball coming to your forehand side is that you turn to the side. So the most common mistake is to use your arm a lot to go back. Instead, you should turn to the side and you should prepare the racket mostly with your off hand. So when you're turning to the side, your right hand is basically resting on the racket. And I will show you the exercises in the biomechanics section of how you can practice that. But for now, your right hand can just rest on the racket and you're basically preparing mostly with your left arm, and you just turn to the side. So just to mention, another mistake that might happen is that you are thinking too much about back. So you're thinking that you must prepare your racket back. You don't prepare your racket back, you prepare it to the side. Just to the side. The rest will just happen during the stroke. So that will be another part of the stroke. And your body will also help with turning, so your racket will be behind you, even if you don't think about behind. So when you're preparing, think about preparing to the side, to the right side. From the preparation phase, for now we're going to stay in the open stance to make it simple, but later we're just going to add one step so that we're going to hit neutral stance. But for now, let's just focus on the arms movements. What needs to happen here? What you're going to start here is you're going to start the drop. You're going to release your racket so that the gravity can assist you with accelerating the racket, and then later you're going to take over. So again, if you want to hit an effortless, a very efficient forehand, you're trying to use laws of physics to your advantage. And what you're trying to use here is gravity, and if you want for gravity to help you, you have to let go. Because you are too strong, you can actually overpower gravity, you can do everything yourself and you will feel no effect of gravity. But if you let go here, then your racket will start to accelerate, your arm will start to accelerate, because your arm also has a certain weight, so it will start to accelerate just by itself, and then you're going to take over and apply some control and some force, or even accelerate if you want to the stroke, but first you're gonna let it go. And the technical checkpoint in this position, if you remember before we were in this position, what I want you to imagine is that when you're dropping the racket, you're dropping it in the direction of the edge. So when you're here, you're just going to loosen up your wrist so that your racket drops like this. So if I show you from this angle, when I turn, this was the ready position, I'm looking forward, then I want to feel that I'm just relaxing my wrist, that I'm dropping my racket in the direction of the edge. So if I show you from this angle, if I'm that way, I don't want to go back with my arm, there's no need to go back, you're just going to drop the racket in the direction of the back edge, so not this way or this way. This one I call the shortcut. When players go from here, they go here, they take a shortcut and then they have no power. So you just want to feel like you're waving. So from this position, if I'm on the side, it feels like a wave. So I just let the racket go, I let the drop start, and then I will take over and use this momentum that I've generated and transfer it into the ball. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to generate momentum. We're not just doing a certain movement in a very mechanical way, but we try to feel that here we generate momentum. This part I call the tipping point, because right here your racket is at the tipping point and then it falls down. One of the reasons why I teach the forehand this way, so that the racket drops in the direction of the edge, is because this will open up your wrist, this will flex your wrist. So your wrist will fall back in this position so that there will be 90-degree angle between your forearm and your wrist or your racket, because this is the position in which your hand or your arm needs to be when you're swinging towards the ball and when you're hitting the ball. And so even when you're preparing your forehand and you go in this position, you might not have fully flexed wrist. So this part we call flexion. So this is maximum flexion. I can't go back anymore with my wrist. So when I'm preparing my forehand, sometimes I might not be at maximum flexion, I might be more relaxed. But when I drop the racket back in the direction of the edge like this, then my wrist will nicely open up and it will just fall into the right position that I need for the contact point. So this is a very good method that teaches your wrist what to do during the stroke, so that you're not also so confused what to do with your wrist or what to do with the racket. So you can just think that your hand goes like this, you go to the side, and then your wrist will just fall down and you will just complete your forehand. We've gone now through the preparation and through the tipping point, and now you've released the racket on the edge, and now the gravity is taking over, it's starting to accelerate the racket. And now we come to the next phase where the acceleration of the racket starts. And the way the racket starts to accelerate, or your arm starts to move forward, is that it has to lag a little bit. So what needs to happen here is that your hips need to start to rotate. So even before that, your legs drive the hips a little bit. But from this position, whether that's an open stance or a neutral stance, here your hips have rotated, so your hips are like this. And now from this position, the body has to work in correct sequence to be very efficient and to produce a lot of power. And the correct sequence is from the ground up. So when your arm is starting to drop, your hips need to start to rotate. So you can just imagine, like a very simple mental image, that your hips are going to do 90 degrees. So they're going to go from this position, if I'm in neutral, to this position. So your hips and your shoulders, they're going to turn. And if we have a loose arm, it's going to be delayed a little bit, it's going to lag a little bit. And that's how we're going to create a certain stretch effect, a certain lag effect that helps us accelerate the arm very efficiently. So I'll show you from this angle. So before I said that when I'm in this position and I'm dropping the racket on the edge, so if I go like that, so I'll show a few in open stance and then a few in a neutral stance so that you see it's not much difference. So I'm here and we started here and we're going back on the edge and then forward. So this is dropping the racket on the edge, basically just relaxing your wrist, letting the gravity take over, and then turn. But what you will see now when I demonstrate my forehand in a at normal speed, if I go like this, so I'll show a few open stance. I go a few like this and then I go a few like this. What you see now is that if I stop, my racket is turned a bit more than just on the edge. So you might be wondering, wait a minute, you were teaching me to drop the racket on the edge, but now when I look at your hand, it's turned more. So it didn't just go down here, it went here. See, so the racket goes more. Now the reason why the racket goes more is not because I do it, but it's because it falls behind. It's because I have a loose wrist, but not a loose grip. I have a loose wrist, and so when I'm going here, if I show you in slow motion, I'm going here, and my intention is, and my feel is, that I'm just dropping the racket on the edge. So my intention is not to put the racket this way. I'm dropping the racket on the edge, but as I'm dropping the racket, I'm simultaneously starting to turn my hips. And so when I start to turn my hips, I pull away from the racket. As you can see, I pull away, and then my racket falls back a bit, and my forearm stretches here. So it falls behind, and this falling behind and this stretch of my forearm gives me a very good elastic band effect. It stretches my forearm, and then my forearm and my arm, also my shoulder, they want to come back to the previous position that they're not stretched, and they're just going to accelerate, especially when I add a little bit of a pull. We've now went through the preparation, the tipping point, we're dropping the racket down, then we are starting to accelerate it by creating a lag. We turn the hips and the racket falls behind, and now it's a part where we swing towards the ball. So this is the part where we're starting to accelerate the racket towards the contact point. So what you should imagine here is that there is a straight line. There is a straight line from here to the ball. One of the most common mistakes that players do is that they think too much in a circle. So they're going from this side, from right side for me, for right-handers, they're going left. So the stroke is not really from right to left. The stroke is much more from behind forward. So it's much more from behind forward. That's why I want to go immediately to the feel-based exercise here, so that you have the right mental image. So again, the mistake that players have is that they imagine a stroke is like a discus throw in athletics. So they think the stroke is when the arm is going around like this, and when we throw the ball like this. So if I show from this angle, players think that the stroke, in their mind's eye, the way they go about the stroke, is like this. So it's in this direction. But the stroke is actually much more like a bowling. So it's going like this. So the stroke is much more here. The arm movement, so it's not 100% here, but it's much more, the forehand stroke is much more this way than it is this way. So the key feel-based exercise for you is to take a few balls and just lift them up like this and bowl them. So try and use your legs, try to do everything together, and try to feel that if you just swing like this and let go, you're going to bowl the ball like this. What I was explaining so far is the fundamentals of the forehand swing. So initially we want to swing more downwards like a bowling motion, because that is a fundamental forehand swing, because we use gravity to help us accelerate the racket. There are of course variations of this swing. When we receive a higher ball, for example, then we don't swing so much down, and we do swing a bit more parallel to the ground. We've now reached the ball in our swing, and now we have to contact the ball. And if we want to apply some control to the ball, we want to spin it a little bit. And to teach the spin, I use the compress and roll exercise. We're basically rolling the ball rather than brushing. Brushing tends to create a bit incorrect mental image where you're hitting the ball but you're just touching it a little bit, so that will not be a good shot. So it's much better to imagine that you press a little bit in the ball and yet you roll it. Now that we've come to the contact point and we are compressing and rolling the ball, we also want to extend a little bit after the ball, because again the movement is more like a bowling movement, so it keeps going forward, or like a throw, so it keeps going forward. And what we try to do is that when we're hitting the ball, we're trying to extend a little bit through the ball. Let me point out here something is that I've noticed that many times players don't aim really well. First of all, they might not even aim. So right now there is a danger that as you focus on your forehand technique, you will just focus on your body and you will stop aiming. So you will have no intention. You can't play tennis without intention, in the same way as you can't drive a car without intention. So if you can't move the levers and clutches and other parts in the car and just look down and move the mechanisms in the car and expect to drive correctly. So in the same way, you can't expect that you're going to hit a good ball if you're not even aiming, if you're not thinking about how you want the ball to fly. So you must have an intention, you must have a trajectory in your mind through which you want to send the ball. And so as you're working on your stroke technique, you also want to know where you're going to hit the ball. But because our mind can do only one thing at a time, it's very likely that right now you're just going to think about your body parts. So you're going to think about technique and this and this and this. And then the ball will go in the net. And then you might think, well, what did I do wrong? You didn't do anything wrong in terms of technique. What you did wrong is that you didn't know what you wanted. You didn't know the direction, you didn't know the height, you didn't know the speed, you didn't know the depth, and you didn't know the amount of spin. So all these are parameters of the stroke that we have to know in some way. And so when you forget about that and you just execute a stroke, then the stroke will just hit the ball. But your forehand does not hit the ball in, you hit the ball in. So you must visualize, you must have a mental image of what you want to do with the ball. We have now been directing the ball, we have extended through the contact zone, and now we just need to complete our stroke in the follow-through. So on the forehand, I teach my players to catch the racket. I recommend that you work on catching the racket with your left hand somewhere above your shoulder in this position, because when you catch the racket, your left arm and your left shoulder will go out of the way. The most common mistake on the forehand follow-through is that the left arm just drops dead and the right arm just goes alone, and then the shoulders tend to fight each other, they're blocking each other. So the player ends up like this, and then this side is not going away and is therefore blocking this side from coming through, and so it's blocking you from moving very naturally, very efficiently. But when we catch the racket, then our shoulders can move freely through the shot, and that helps us generate more power and move much more efficiently. And so again, the catching with the left is basically just to release the shoulders. It's not so important the left arm. What is important is that our shoulders rotate. So I really recommend that you work on catching your racket. If you don't do that, and in the biomechanics section I will show you plenty of exercises for the left arm, because that's how we use the shoulder axis correctly, which is one of the main sources of power. So when we don't use the left arm correctly, it also means that we're not using the shoulder axis correctly, we're not rotating our shoulders correctly, and therefore we're losing on power and efficiency. So again, I really recommend that you catch the racket here with your left hand, because it will help you rotate nicely through the ball.